Welcome to the afternoon PLMW session number 2 of Monday. We have a very exciting program prepared for you, so we will start. And apologies again for the technical difficulty. We will start with a talk on how to design talks. And in the second hour, we have a very exciting panel prepared for you on charting your path. So I hope you will stick with us for the full 2 hours. So, but for the first hour, without further ado, let me introduce my colleague and friend, Ranjit Jhala from UC San Diego. Ranjit is, a real staple of the community, has received many awards, probably most recently the 2018 Robin Milner Young Researcher Award from the PL community. And Ranjit is very famous for giving really great talks. And I have to say for myself that a lot of the stuff, probably most of the stuff I know about how to give talks, I learned from Ranjit. So I hope you will all benefit greatly from this talk. So take it away, Ranjit.
Okay, well, thank you, Nadia. This is very awkward. I've never, in fact, given a talk like this. Well, actually, except for my lectures. Well, anyway, thank you, Nadia, Milind, and Adrian and Steve for this opportunity to talk at PLMW. I'm, yeah, I've just, I kind of obsess a bit about talks, and I want to kind of tell you what I think makes for a good talk, and not so much what makes for a good talk, but really a recipe that you should use in order to construct, sort of to build your own talks in the first place. Okay, so first, let me just say a few words about myself. So as Nadia pointed out, I'm a, what is the word you use, Nadia? A staple. I've been advising students for, I'm quite surprised to learn, for nearly 15 years now. And here are some of my students. I'm very proud of all of them and all the work that they've done. These are the students who graduated, in case there are a few who are tuning in from home wondering why they aren't on this slide. And as pretty much all of these students will tell you, um, I spend a lot of time kind of going over their, how, going over how they should make their talks, and essentially the few weeks leading up to PLDI, when they have papers at PLDI, are a very stressful time for everybody, because we spend a lot of time iterating over our talks and over our slides. And why is it that I obsess so much about good talks? Okay, so I mean, some of it must be just some strange OCD psychological thing, but there is also a more serious reason. Okay, the more serious reason why I obsess about giving talks is perhaps summed up by this gentleman who has a scary-looking face, but has a very excellent advice on the matter of doing research. So this is Howard Aiken. He's one of the kind of pioneers of the computing field. He designed I think it was the ENIAC, which was one of the first computing systems back in the 40s at Harvard University, if I recall correctly. And Howard Aiken had this piece of advice about research, which is, he said, don't worry about people stealing your ideas. If it's an original idea, if it's actually an interesting idea, you will have to ram it down their throats. Okay, so this was Howard Aiken's advice. This is not something, you don't want to keep your research or your ideas to yourself. If the idea is any good, you are going to have to do a lot of work spreading the word. Okay, and to me, a talk is the best way to spread the word. Okay, you essentially get a fairly large and captive audience, and I'll come back to the subject of large and captive in just a second. And this is an audience to which, you have just this. There's so many things you can do, right? You want to inspire the audience. Why? You want to tell them about your new research. Maybe you want to tell them about some work you're doing so that you can recruit new collaborators to your cause. Maybe you can help you you're building a new tool, and you want to get people to come and join your community, help you add new features, so on and so forth. You want to inspire them with your ideas to convince them that this is a cool project that you should work on. Maybe you're building some kind of library and you just want to get new users for your library. And the best way to do that is to sort of show off what you're doing in your talk. And most importantly, another excellent piece of advice I got from a colleague at UCLA that some of you might know, Jens, is you should think of every talk as essentially a kind of job talk. It's like an interview. Every talk that you give is you're sort of showing off to the world a view of what you do, what you care about, what your sensibilities are, and what your values are, right? And this is why I really obsess about giving talks, and why you should also obsess about giving talks. So before I sort of get into the nitty gritty of how to prepare talks, I really want to emboss this idea, sort of imprint this in your brains, which is, of all the things that you will learn in graduate school, and even if you don't go to graduate school as an undergraduate, you should make it your business to really learn how to communicate well. This is probably the most important thing. By communicate, I mean learning to talk and learning to write. These are the most important things that you will do, no matter which of the many career trajectories that you might follow, over the course of your life, right? This is just going to be essential, not just for teaching, not just for industry, not just if you're an engineer. It doesn't matter what you do. Communication is probably the most important skill, and this is one thing I've learned in my whatever 20 plus years in as a computer scientist. Okay, great. So that's good. Let's assume that you buy my proposition that you really must learn how to give good talks. This brings us to the question of, what does it mean to give a good talk? How does one go about giving good talks? And to me, there are roughly three pillars of being able to give a good talk. Okay. The first, of course, is how can you create good content? Like, maybe, what are you even going to talk about, right? In a sense, this pertains to what kind of research do you do, what kind of topics do you select to do your research, etc., etc. The second is what I'm going to focus on here, which is, I'm not going to talk about how to do research, how to create the content. I'm just going to focus on how to design the talk itself. So I'm going to assume that you already know what you want the talk to be about, roughly speaking. You know the content. And we're going to focus just on the whatever 30 minutes or 1 hour or 45 minutes, whatever it is you have to produce for your talk. But there's a third part that is equally important, which I'm not going to talk about. I'll just have some brief pointers at the end, which is, how do you actually deliver the talks? Okay, so this is quite separate. So to me, there's content. How do you actually design the talk? How do you construct the slides themselves? And then how do you deliver the talks? And for the next half an hour or so, we are just going to focus on one aspect, which is, how do you just go about the business of designing the talks? Okay, the other two, they're easily topics worthy of their own PLMW sessions or talks, and I'm not going to focus on them really. Okay, um, let me just pause here for a second and see if there are any questions. So Nadia pointed out that I should probably break at various points and look at some questions. I got a question. Someone asks, what font am I using for the slides and why? Now, that's a fascinating question. I'm going to hold that till the end because it's a somewhat low-level question. It's a very important one, and I spend a lot of time obsessing about that. It's called, if you really want to know, American Iowa or something like that. Why I like serif and I like the somewhat classic look of this font. But anyway, it's some of these things are rather particular to me. Okay, good. So let's return to the subject of how to design talk. So the very first thing that you have to do when you think about designing your talk is, you want to think about, what is the goal of your talk? Okay, so I should make another kind of meta remark over here, which is that as I sort of, as I give you this talk, the talk is also an example of all the things that I'm talking about. Okay, I guess what is the fancy PL word for this? It's a self-circular, I forget what it is, right? But the talk is somewhat self-referential, in that I'm going to be describing various things, and I encourage you to kind of revisit the slides after we're done, because the talk is kind of supposed to illustrate itself the principles that it's enunciating. So anyway, I'll call this out in the course of the talk as well. So anyway, the first thing that you have to do when you're thinking about your talk is, you have to answer the question, what is our goal? What do you want to do? What is the aim of the talk? Okay. And so let me pop back now to my specific talk, that is this particular talk. What is my goal, or what was my goal when I wanted to design this particular talk? So as I said at the very beginning, my goal is to encourage you. The talk is how you spread wisdom, get users, inspire people to do your research, etc., etc. But there's also a secondary and equally kind of crucial goal. We want to spread wisdom, but without losing to Candy Crush. Okay, so the purpose to me of designing a talk is to somehow help the audience focus on the material itself. Okay, it's very, very easy, and it's like a billion times easier now for those of you who are sitting at home. You are one alt tab away from something that is probably 10 times more fun than this talk, right? There's a billion other videos you could be watching on YouTube. You could be going to Netflix. If you were at a conference, then, well, you would have to kind of furtively look at your phone screen and maybe eke out a little game of Candy Crush. But right now, your opportunities are limitless. Okay, so how do I, or how do you, when you design a talk, eliminate these opportunities for the audience members to get lost? Okay, and so I'm going to kind of keep returning to this theme, because to me, everything that informs how I design a talk goes back to this question: how do I enable focus? How do I make it really, really hard for the audience member to kind of tune out? And dually, if they do tune out, how can I make it really easy for them to jump back on the wagon? Okay, now there's a bunch of um, wisdom, shall I say, that goes back purportedly to the ancients on how to design talks to, to allow people to kind of focus. And one of the kind of famous pieces of advice that is attributed to the Greek philosopher Aristotle goes something like this, right? So the way you design a talk is: step one, tell them what you will tell them. Okay, so like I'm telling you, this is how you should design a talk. Step two is tell them. And then step three is tell them what you just told them. Okay, so it's a kind of a fault tolerant system. You sort of predict what you're going to tell them, then do the thing, and then you kind of tell them what you just told them. It's a kind of reinforcing thing. So I got this advice myself when I was preparing talks, but there were various things that I didn't find satisfying about it. So first of all, it is in fact not due to Aristotle, but far more recent and far less kind of pedigreed. This was advice that a pastor in the UK sort of wrote on. Gave to young pastors at I guess a pastor mentoring workshop, if you wish, in a little essay called "Three Parts of a Sermon." And you'll see actually we're going to return to this topic of sermons later in this presentation. But the second thing that worried me about this particular piece of advice is, for those of you who've seen this particular meme on the internet, you know how it is, right? How to draw an owl? Well, first you start off by drawing some circles. So you draw, this is going to be the head, and then this is going to be the body. And then step two, draw the rest of the freaking owl. Okay. So it doesn't really tell you how to produce the owl. It sort of is very high level, and then you jump all the way to the detail, to the final finished product. So this is not super actionable. So instead, let's sort of turn this away, and let me tell you how I think about designing talks. Okay, so the very first thing that we're going to do, that you should do when you think about a talk, is, once you've identified your goal, you want to construct a story. So think of it as the overall narrative arc for your talk. Okay, and I'm going to put this in quotes over here. Roughly speaking, the story is going to correspond to your outline. Okay, we'll see each of these in great detail in a second. Second, once you have an idea of what your story is, what your narrative arc is, the story itself is going to let you break up your talk into what I call individual scenes or sections. Okay, and finally, once you've figured out what your individual scenes or sections are, that's when you get down to the nitty-gritty of designing or developing individual frames or slides. Okay, so don't start with the slides first. We're gonna follow this progression where you first start with the story, then think of the scenes, and then think of the frames. And I will explain what I mean by each of these terms in detail. And like I said, this talk itself is kind of self-referential. We're going to follow this arc as we go along. Okay, so first, the story. Okay, so as I said, we've sort of hinted at this already. The way you think of your story, the way you design your story, is you start by identifying your goal. Okay, so the goal is ultimately the key one or two or three ideas that you want to kind of ram down, that you want to spread the wisdom about to your audience. Okay, so you start with this goal, which you can think of as this little house. That's where I want to go. And then what you want to do is you want to think of your story as a path, as literally a road or a route that is a path to your particular goal. Okay, so what is the story? The story is you have some kind of solution, some wisdom, some goal that you want to arrive at. There is some starting point where you assume most of the audience members are. And now what you want to do in your story is to somehow identify or carve out, design, develop, whatever word you want, a path to your goal. Okay. So now this begs the question, okay, very good. You want a path. How does one go about designing a path? What even makes for a path? Okay. Um, and to me, the way I think of designing a path is kind of similar to what happens when, if I'm looking for directions to actually, 2 days ago, I guess we're all in the COVID lockdown and whatnot, but things are getting really relaxed a little bit in San Diego. So they just opened up the beaches, and I wanted to check out a new beach that I hadn't been to. And so I knew the name of this beach and I punched it into Google or whatever. And the way you get back a path from Google is via a collection of landmarks, right? It says go there, then turn right at so and so thing. Then once you hit the such and such freeway, take a merge onto so and so thing, and you keep getting this sequence of landmarks, right, one by one. And these landmarks are how you kind of identify and how you architect a particular trajectory, okay, a particular path, okay. And so, in order to actually build up our story, what we're going to do is build up the individual landmarks that sort of show us that point that build the way along from the problem to the solution. Okay, so let's look at a concrete example. And like I said, I'm going to use this particular talk as my example because I don't want to drag in some other thing which requires some research background. So what is my goal? As I said, my goal was I have a fickle audience, or an audience that has at its fingertips quite literally access to everything that's on Netflix and everything that's on YouTube, and maybe you just got a $7 subscription to Disney Plus and you haven't seen the latest episodes of The Mandalorian, who knows what, right? So I have a fickle audience, and somehow I want to teach this audience about how to design talks where they can enable their own audience to sort of maintain focus. And so the way I'm going to think of my landmarks are literally this, right? My landmark is, first, I'm going to tell you about the story. Then I'm going to tell you how to break your story up into individual scenes. And then I'll tell you how to break individual scenes up into frames. And at that point, I will have given you my kind of design recipe, so-called, for building talks that help the audience maintain focus. Okay? Let me just pause here for a question, because before we jump in, someone asks, is there any difference in how one should design an online talk versus an in-person talk? That's a very good question. Now, I should say most of my experience is with online talks. And so maybe the world of in-person talks is quite different. Sorry, let me flip that around. Most of my experience is with in-person talks, and my experience with online talks is quite limited. And so I'm just going to hope that in-person talks carry over somewhat into online talks. But to be honest, for example, even this back and forth that we're having right now, where you can ask me questions on Slido, this is not something that we would probably have done if we had met in person, right? So these new modes of interaction are quite fascinating, and I just spent the last quarter teaching a class with this new mode of interaction. So I'm not sure if they carry over directly, but I think the vast majority of what I'm telling you right now does carry over. Okay, so that's my hypothesis. But to be honest, at the end of this talk, you will probably have a better sense of whether they carry over or not. Okay, great. So in order to identify the story, as I said, you want to find your goal, identify your goal, make sure you know exactly what it is you want to achieve with your talk, and then you want to identify the individual's kind of milestones that get you to that particular goal. Now, you may ask, why did I pick those particular landmarks? How does one go about picking landmarks? What makes for a good set of landmarks? This is kind of crucial. Okay, so there's a couple of design principles that you want to make sure you stick to. The first of these principles is quite a standard thing from programming languages. Okay, definition before use. So typically, you want to make sure that you describe problems before you describe solutions. So in your landmarks, as you pick your landmarks, you can't tell me about a solution before you've even told me what the problem is. Okay, so you must always, for example, make sure you don't put the cart before the horse, as they say. That's what this little picture is showing, right? Describe your problems before you tell us your solutions. Give me high-level intuition before you actually give me some fancy definitions and formalism and some math. There's some just basic rules like that, right? So, of course, you want to give your definitions before uses, but there's yet another heuristic that people sometimes forget. That's kind of crucial, okay? which is the way I think about it is you want to make sure that you minimize bandwidth. Okay, so remember, everything goes back to, again, enabling focus. And I think of bandwidth in this situation as the amount of mental state, the stuff that an audience member has to remember in order for your talk to make sense. So what do I mean? Here's a little picture that should illustrate. So along the x-axis, this is just time, right? As I said, you want to put your definitions before you put your uses, okay? So imagine I do something like this, right? I define 5 different things, or maybe I lay up 4 different problems here, and then I tell you about 4 different solutions in the future. The problem with this approach is it's very high bandwidth. If you think about it, whoops, this is what the bandwidth looks like, right? At any point in the future, the audience member must remember all of these 4 definitions. So at this point, at this midway point at the 15-minute mark, I have to remember all these different things. And so it makes sense not to rig your milestones in this fashion, because that's too much bandwidth. Instead, what you want to do is reorder the definitions and the use so that at each point, the bandwidth is super small. I just have to remember one thing. Okay, so these are some of the constraints that you want to follow. The second constraint that you want to bear in mind, okay, as you design your landmarks, is what I think of as a V-shaped complexity. Okay, and I should say one thing. This is someone asked about, does this advice apply to kind of in-person versus online talks? I think it applies to both, because I think some of this also applies, for example, to writing, to just sheets of, when you write a 10-page or a 15-page paper. There's this notion of V-shaped complexity. And what do I mean by that? Let's again make a little graph, right? So as I said, the thing I obsess about, that you should obsess about when you make a talk, is preserving audience attention. Now, no matter how clever my fonts are, how slick my animations are, how funny my jokes are, how good my slide craft is, this is what audience attention is going to look like. Okay, over time, when the talk starts is when you have your peak attention. Okay, right at the beginning is when everybody is paying attention. And so right then is when you want to start with highest level motivation and things like that, right? If you have some really nice results, you want to kind of front load that kind of stuff right at the beginning. Over time, inevitably, no matter how good, how good I am, people's attention is going to, slowly drift off. That is one. Not just that, over time, the talk is probably going to start getting more and more technical about, it's going to drill into the details of whatever it is you're going to talk about. Okay, so you want to make sure that as you introduce the details, this is gradual. It's not sudden. You don't like drop off a sudden cliff. So people are kind of slowly going down the hill with you. And then over time, as the talk ends, once again, audience attention is going to perk up, because people are at this point expecting, okay, this is like a wrap-up message. Maybe I'm going to get some high-level wisdom or some nice high-level summary and consequences. So you again want to make sure that as the talk ends, you pop up a bit and you don't go into very low-level details at the end. You sort of pop up and you let people get back, people who you might have lost in the middle, but you can help them kind of get back into your talk. Okay. Great. So the third thing I'm going to tell you about landmarks is that you should really think about these landmarks. One heuristic for knowing whether your landmarks are any good is that you ought to be able to reuse your landmarks as the outline for your talk. Okay, so I think of the landmarks as not just, there's kind of structuring your talk, but they're also useful as an outline. For example, here are my landmarks. And guess what? They were also my outline. Okay, so my landmarks were, I'm breaking up this talk into what is the story, and then I'll tell you about scenes, and then I'll tell you about frames. We haven't seen that yet. But this is a good thing for several reasons. One is that repetition is going to reinforce the landmarks. Okay, so it's almost like error coding. It's okay for people to kind of lose attention or to kind of lose their focus for a little bit, because once I come back to the outline, they'll again say, oh, right, this is where we were. This was the grand scheme of things. We were supposed to get from A to B. This was the sequence of milestones. I lost a little bit of track in what exactly Jhala was talking about with story, but no matter, I will now pick up again once he starts talking about scenes or frames and so on and so forth. Okay, so this kind of thing helps you it prevents getting lost. And even if you do get lost, it helps people kind of get pulled back onto the wagon, as it were. Okay, good. So to wrap up on the subject of story, the key is to identify landmarks. How do you identify landmarks? There's a couple of heuristics that I use. One is you want to make sure you put definitions before uses. You want to make sure you do that in a way that minimizes bandwidth. Okay, I don't have to remember like 50,000 things at any given time. Two, you want to make sure you have this kind of V-shaped complexity. So start with simple things that are accessible to everyone up at the beginning, get more detailed gradually, and then as the talk ends, once again, it should be pretty high level. And three, you should really stick to this heuristic. You ought to design your landmarks so that the landmarks themselves can be a kind of outline slide that would sort of pop up again and again and again in the course of your talk. Okay, fantastic. So that's how you pick landmarks. Let me now transition, and now you can see how the landmarks are helping. If people have forgotten, this would be a good way now to transition to the second part where you have already identified the landmarks, and now let's see what you do from then on. However, let me take a break and let me see if there are some questions that I should answer. So Animesh asks, how much should we think of inclusivity while designing slides? For example, use text colors that are, this is crucial actually. So Animesh, sorry, I just read the thing and I forgot to read the words out. Let me just read the question out exactly. How much should we think of inclusivity while designing slides? For example, use text colors that are friendly to colorblind people. So I think this is an excellent piece of advice. You must do this. And one way that this happens, I don't want to say it happens naturally, is you must, once you've sort of designed your color scheme and your fonts and so on and so forth, you should try and do a couple of practices, and you will get people who will tell you that either the fonts are too small, make them much larger, use particular colors, don't make contrasts that are not easily visible to folks who have trouble distinguishing colors and so on. And there are in fact lots of very good resources that I can, maybe I'll just add a link to the Slack on picking color schemes and fonts and so on that specifically address this particular topic. Thanks for that excellent question, Animesh. Okay, great. So now let's talk a bit about designing scenes. Okay, so what is a scene and how does the scene connect with the story? Okay, so to me, a scene is the following. The scene is essentially a very short path that's between two landmarks. Okay, so remember how we took the entire trajectory, broke it up into landmarks. To me, a scene is an individual edge in that graph. It's a short trajectory between two landmarks. Now, the single most important thing I can say about each individual scene is what is summarized, I think, in show business or in writing circles as show, don't tell. What does that mean? What it means in plain pictures is use examples. Okay, don't use large chunks of text, just use examples. And if you can have more examples, the better, right? If your talk is just a sequence of examples and pictures, that is fantastic. So specifically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you. My goal is to help you think of a scene as essentially a sequence of transitions. So not an individual slide. It's just think of it. The reason I use the word scene is I really think of it as an entire 5-minute segment, a trajectory that gets you from one path to another. Okay, that gets you from one point in your on your path to the next landmark. Okay, so don't think of a scene as a set of slides. Think of it as a whole sequence of transitions. Okay, great. And what is the sequence of transitions doing? It's going to build you up to your example. So how are we going to build up a particular scene? So here's how I think of it. Okay, so here's my recipe. The first thing that I do is, in fact, I work backwards in a scene. So what I do is think of each scene as comprising one large example. What we're going to do is we're going to identify a complete example. So think of the whole example, okay, that I want to show, that I want to convey by virtue of this scene. And how do I identify a complete example? Well, there's a fair bit of thought that goes into this, right? So one of the best pieces of advice that I learned from this, which was completely unrelated to making talks, it's a kind of generally useful piece of advice, comes from a wonderful book called The Little Prince, which if you have not read, you must read. One of my favorite undergraduate professors said, it's like 98% of all the wisdom you need to have a happy life lives in The Little Prince. And here is one of my favorite lines from The Little Prince, which says, perfection is achieved, the ... says, not when there is something left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Okay, so to me, the ideal example is one where there is nothing left. It explains exactly what it is you want to explain and has no extraneous detail. Okay, of course, this is going to be different depending on what exactly it is you want to explain and so on and so forth, right? But once you identify this example, what you want to do is take that example and construct the last slide in your trajectory, not the first, the last slide. Like I said, we're going to work backwards. Okay, so as an example, imagine that the landmark that I want to show you is the Eiffel Tower, and here is the complete Eiffel Tower, right? So we're going to start by creating the scene's last slide. Now let's look at it. Does this show the essential elements? Is there, in fact, as the little prince might say, is it as simple as possible? Is there nothing left to take away? Does it fit nicely on the screen? If it's too large, that's too much, right? So you want to make sure that it's just, it sort of fits nicely, and so on and so forth. Once you've sort of answered the question of, is it complete and is it small enough? Is it kind of perfect per the little prince? Then what we're going to do is we're going to build up the rest of the scene by slowly removing the elements. So what do I mean? That's the final slide. We're going to work backwards by slowly stripping things away from it, starting with the simplest thing at the very beginning. Okay, and what the result is a sequence of transitions that builds up to your landmark. Okay, so you want to start with the final example and then slowly keep chipping away at it, almost working backwards till you have nothing, right? Till you begin with nothing. And that gives you the kind of trajectory for how you want to show people the particular landmark that you're trying to build. Okay, great. So what's a scene? It's a sequence of transitions where we kind of show this landmark by example. Now, I have this third rule that I use, which is somewhat controversial, but I think of it as, I think it's a good heuristic, right? You know that your scene makes sense, again, to make this kind of movie making analogy, if the scene kind of makes sense without any audio, without any speech or any words. Okay, so it ought to make sense if you just show the images, just the slides one after the other. Do the slides on their own make sense as a kind of silent movie? So let me show you an example of a scene, again, by example, as I promised. Okay, so I had to give a talk at, I forget where, well, actually it was at a PLDI a couple of years ago. It doesn't really matter what the talk was about. It was, I had to, there was one individual scene where I wanted to talk about a particular data structure called an interval set. Okay, so this was the landmark I wanted to convey in the scene. The final finished thing that I wanted to show the audience was this notion of an interval set. And so what did I do? I first, so again, I kind of designed these scenes. No keynote, no PowerPoint has been involved yet. It's just on pencil and paper, right? I'm just constructing this storyboard style, right? I have an interval set. And then, as I said, I first identify a complete example. So this is what the complete example just sketched out on a piece of paper looked like. Looked something like this. Like, this is what the final slide in my example will look like, right? There was something about represent a set of integers, ordered into a list, something, doesn't matter if you can read my handwriting or not. Then I was like, okay, that's my complete example. How do I sequence it into transitions? By essentially removing bits one by one, right? So this is the final slide. I'm going to delete the last line. I'm going to delete the middle line, and I'll delete the first line. And then we have the kind of the finished product, which was, I'm going to think of as the monkey test. Let's see if this even works. Please work. Whoa, it did not work totally. There should be some way to, this is supposed to be a little video clip. Hang on, let me see if I can get this video clip to work on PowerPoint, on Keynote. Click, click, click. Ah, there, it's working. See, data, you can check it out now, right? Data structure, 1, 2, 3 into intervals, and so on and so forth, right? So this was, this final slide corresponds to what I showed you by hand as what I sketched out. And then the scene was this sequence of transitions leading up to this particular thing. Okay, hopefully it made sense without audio. Now, of course, in this case, this particular example may not make sense because it was kind of detailed and there was a whole bunch of context, but I'm just giving you the general idea. Okay, great. So that's what a scene was. Sequence of transitions that takes you from one landmark to the next landmark. Okay, and next I'm going to tell you about an individual frame. But before I do that, let us take a couple of questions. Anonymous says, this sounds compelling, but it seems that the same methodology could apply equally well to writing the paper. Excellent observation, Anonymous. You are absolutely correct. In fact, it applies not just to writing. In the paper, much of this becomes sections, and what I'm calling scenes and frames becomes roughly paragraphs, right? So the methodology applies very well. There are a couple of differences with paper. So the main difference in the paper, and this kind of goes away in this kind of new YouTube streaming modality that we're in. The main difference in the paper is that you can have hyperlinks, and you can say things like, go jump ahead and go jump backwards. So remember how I said this thing about remembering stuff? You don't really have to worry about that in paper, because you can just add a back pointer, recall in section 2 we said so and so, right? And people can, like, if they're doing it at least on PDF, on their iPad or whatever, right? You can just click, go and see the definition. Yes, that's the definition, right? So some of those constraints don't really apply, because paper is not necessarily quite so linear. Nobody really reads a paper just from like page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. You can kind of flit around. So that, I would say, is the main difference. So some of those constraints don't apply, but the high level bit, which is you want to break things down into the outline and so on and so forth, front load things with attention span, those very much apply. And if you haven't, I strongly recommend that you see Simon Peyton Jones's PLMW talk. It's on a YouTube thing somewhere, on how to write papers. It is fantastic. And frankly, you can see Simon Peyton Jones talk about how to crack an egg, and it would be fantastic. But specifically, his advice on how to write papers is amazing, and it sort of echoes a lot of this advice. How do you get good at adding animations? Adding animations and transitions at your to your presentations? That's a great question. The short answer, to be quite honest, is, as with everything else in life, the way you get good at something is practice. So you just have to kind of practice, and do that. Now, that's one, I will say. A more selfish thing I will say is that um, I like watching movies, and I guess to me it's it's kind of a justification for why I like watching movies or cartoons or whatnot. It's like, oh, I can pick up tips on how to explain things and sort of do things with flashbacks and fast forwards, and how to have, but I don't think the second piece of advice is really serious. I think that's just rationalizing something I like to do. Really, the way you get good at adding animations and transitions is practicing. But there are a couple of things that I will talk about, Anonymous. I don't know your name, but there are a couple of things that I'm going to talk about in this third section when we start talking about frames, which will address this particular question, like what makes for a good animation, what's a good transition, etc., etc. And so let's hold your question. Maybe we can come back to it when we talk about frames. Okay, so part 3, what exactly is a frame? Okay, so like I said, a scene is a sequence of transitions, and a frame to me then is what is on a single slide at a particular point in time. Okay, now if there is one thing that you should take away from this talk, literally if there's just one piece of advice you should take away on this talk, it is the following. On a slide, it should be perfectly obvious what one thing the audience member should be focusing on. Okay, there should be, on a slide, if I imagine I was sleeping, okay, I've been sleeping for the last 25 minutes, I just open my eyes and I look at the slide, it should be completely obvious what I should be looking at. There should not be too many things. Okay, there should be just one thing to focus on. Why? Again, remember the mantra, which is enable focus. If there are more than one things to focus on, I don't know what thing I should be focusing on. I'm lost. Candy Crush, here I come. Okay, or Mandalorian, here I come. Okay, so how do you design a frame to make it completely obvious what you should be focusing on? Okay, so there's a couple of heuristics to use. The first is, of course, be minimal. If there's literally 2 words on the slide, what else are you going to look at? Okay, being minimal essentially makes the focus obvious. So Jonathan Shuchuk has a nice talk on how to make talks. And I have a link to it later in this. I'll point you to it. But he has this, what he calls the 12 words per slide rule, which sometimes works and sometimes you have to relax it. But anyway, the simplest way to make sure that it's obvious what to focus on is to just make sure that there's no more than 12 words. Specifically, what it means is, now I apologize to all the previous and future PLMW presenters who have slides that look like this. Do not ever make slides that look like this. Okay, I guess we're going to have to read some of this stuff on the slide because it violates the rules. But I have to kind of show you how the rules are violated and why it's terrible to violate the rules, just so that you don't violate them yourselves. Okay, so do not ever make slides like this. What am I supposed to be looking at? There are like 7 bullet points. If I just woke up, I don't know which bar to be looking at, right? This is horrible. First of all, I don't like bullet points. Avoid them if you can. They're just, I don't like them. I don't know what I can say. But the only thing that's even worse than bullet points are nested bullet points. Just the despicable. And I don't know why Keynote and PowerPoint even let you nest 3 levels deep. It's just horrible. Now, this is one, it seems like a really OCD thing, but I cannot tell you how important it is. It really is, okay? Never ever wrap text around a sentence. Okay, there is something very annoying, and there's actually research that I didn't know this. Okay, I gave this talk, and then people told me, you know what? There's people, cognitive scientists, who've written about this. When you have text that sort of goes all the way to the end, and then I have to wrap around. It is very, very distracting to have to do that. Don't ask me why. It's just how the brain works. Okay, it's just how the muscles in the eye, like, we do not like this. It's taxing. Okay, so if you are going to have text, just make sure it goes from left to right or right to left, depending on what language you're in. But do not force me to do a visual carriage return. Okay, let's move on. I can't see that slide anymore. The second thing about building a frame, and this gets to the anonymous's question about transitions and so on, is if you cannot be minimal, right? Sometimes, you know what, I need to put multiple things on a slide, like I showed you in that interval sets example a few minutes ago. If you cannot be ultra minimal, then at the very least, be incremental. And this sort of dovetails with the advice that I gave you about a scene building up to a landmark. Okay, so remember how when we had the Eiffel Tower, I don't want to show you the whole Eiffel Tower because that's too much. On each individual slide, I just want to show you on what the diff is that this one slide produces. Okay, so for example, let's go back to that same example that I showed. On each slide, the thing that the audience member is supposed to focus on is the diff that you had with respect to the previous slide. And you should kind of think about developing your, hang on, my screen has, I, I've gotten locked out of the, oh Lord help us. I've gotten locked out of my Slido thanks to an unfortunate password situation. Okay, so let's see how the slide focus is going to be on the diff. So here was my data structure to represent sets. Let's see what's going to happen, right? So it's going to move up. You look at that bit, then you look at that bit, partitioning into intervals. And at each point, the transition is what you're focusing on. So there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but at each point, what you were supposed to focus on is just the particular diff. Okay. Finally, sometimes even that is not enough. You just have to have a lot of things and you need to have them all up at the same time. In that case, what you want to do, the way you want to design your transitions, is you want to highlight the focus. Tell me what I should be looking at. There's a lot of stuff on the slide. Tell me what I should be looking at. So to give you an example of this, I'm going to allude to this kind of children's book. There's a series of books. It's a kind of fun game that some of you might know about. It's kind of a classic thing called Where's Waldo? So in these books, what happens is there's this character. So look at Waldo. There's a kind of definition before you. So I'm defining Waldo. This is Waldo over here, right? He looks like this. He's got these big round glasses, this kind of striped shirt and so on. And the game in all of these Waldo books is you are supposed to find Waldo. So here's a picture with lots of people. Oh, are they at a beach? I guess so. It looks kind of like a beach. Check it out. There's a crab over there. But anyway, the job here is to find Waldo. And of course, it's not obvious how do you find Waldo. But guess what? As you're when designing a talk, you want to enable focus. And here's how you highlight. There is Waldo. Okay, so there are various ways in which you can fade everything else out and just draw my eyes to where Waldo is. And I don't know how good the resolution is on the YouTube screen, but at least you can see the little hat and the little glasses. That's definitely Waldo. So let's go back to my good old interval sets as an example to show you how you might sort of highlight the focus over there, right? So here's this data type. Now notice here is how I'm highlighting the focus, okay? And I'm using the same joint color scheme where I want to say that's an example over there, it's in blue, and this is whatever, it's connected to some data type. It doesn't matter what the specifics are. It's just this little blue shading there's a whole bunch of stuff, so I don't know what I should be looking at, but the blue is telling me focus here, look here, okay? So that's pretty much it. That's all I'm going to say about designing individual frames. The essential thing is to make the focus obvious. Don't make me work to think about what I should be looking at. The easiest way to do that is to put very little up on the slide to start with. If you can't do that, then gradually build things up. And so you can just, the viewer knows to look at just the diff, the incremental parts. And if you can't even do that, because there's just a lot of things, sometimes there's just too much stuff, tell me what I should be looking at. Highlight the focus. Now, I should, of course, point out that this is it's a very general recipe. First, identify your goal, find landmarks towards that goal. Second, think of your scene as sort of subparts from one landmark to the next. And once you've identified each of the individual scenes, now go in and fill in the scene by designing the individual frames that build up the particular transition. the tricky business with all of this is, of course, there's a kind of chicken and egg problem, right? Sometimes when you think you've nailed down the story, you've figured out the scene, and then when you're implementing the frame, you realize, oh no, I forgot to tell people about so and so definition up at the beginning, and so you just have to iterate. You have to like, right, that was a crucial thing. I should have thought of that, and I should have put it into my story. And you kind of have to spin around this a few times to get it just right. Um, I'm kind of getting to the end over here, so let me just say a few more things. Let me remind you that I've just picked 1/3 of the important bits on how to give talks. The important parts are, how do you come up with content? Hopefully there'll be other talks at this PLMW that address that. If not, there's lots of great resources that we can point you to. I just talked about how to design the talks once you have the content. The third and equally important part is how to actually deliver the talk. How do you physically, go out and give the talk? This is something that, as with transitions, as with constructing, slides and pictures, just requires a lot of practice. Okay, so one thing you can do is, watch other people who have given good talks. So there's a famous computer scientist, James Mickens, who's a sort of systems and security person, who's, I believe, at Harvard right now. And James Mickens is a wonderful writer, and he's just a ridiculously good speaker. I mean, he's like on another level. And so this a person called Adrian Felt, who is on Twitter, I saw this. I've met James. I don't think I've actually met Adrian. I just saw this on Twitter. Adrian Felt tweeted this. I asked James Mickens what was his trick for giving a truly funny and insightful talk, and his answer was, you spend 3 months preparing and study videos of other inspiring speakers. And it's just a lot of work, but that's how you really learn to kind of deliver talks. And there are 3 specific categories of speakers that I would advise you to think about. That obviously there's well-known computer scientists or technical people that you might listen to, but sometimes it's good to kind of pop your head outside the bubble. And the 3 categories that I would say is, first of all, preachers. So remember how I made this remark about the 3 parts of a sermon? Well, preachers are, they give sermons, they have to hold an audience, they have to kind of enable focus an hour, I guess an hour every week. And they are really, really good at it. So just like go and find YouTube videos of Martin Luther King speeches, for example, to get an idea of just, how one delivers talks. It's something else, right? Then, of course, there is politicians, right? And of course, now, not all politicians are created equal. Some politicians are better speakers than others. But once again, you should go and listen to some great speeches by well-known politicians. And the third category that might not come immediately to mind, but that is, I think, a fantastic training ground for learning how to give good talks, is comedians. So, there's just any number of videos that you can find online. You will just learn about how you can construct things so that you can hold people's attention, how you can pace things, how you reveal things without revealing too much, so on and so forth, right? So if you got nothing else out, 1, there should be 1 thing you should look at a slide at a time, and 2, try and listen to some other great speakers to learn how to deliver talks, right? So that's it. That's all I'm going to say. This is my general recipe for how to design talks. Let me repeat. First, find your goal and develop your story as a sequence, as a set of landmarks that incrementally build up to the goal. Then recursively, you kind of go inside and you build up each scene as a path between 2 landmarks. And then recursively, you kind of drill down and you you build up each scene by building up a sequence of frames that slowly builds up to the landmark for that particular scene, but where the focus is made completely obvious. Before I finish, I'll finish and take some questions. Here are a couple of slides. Well, I'll just leave this up here so people can take the link. So Derek has a very nice talk on specifically that focuses on how to give technical talks, and Jonathan Shuchuk also has a nice paper on how to sort of structure your talks. But these sort of offer somewhat complementary advice to the kind of specifically designing the talk that I focused on over here. So let me pop back to this, which is, I think, a reasonable way to have as a final slide, and let me look at some questions now. Let's see. Uday Khedkar asks, sometimes a great and enthusiastic delivery of a talk hides the message. How does one strike a balance between what is to be conveyed and how it is to be conveyed? That's a great question. You mean because the speaker, I'm assuming I'm reading, trying to interpret what the question is. I guess sometimes, perhaps, Uday, what you are referring to is that the speaker is so charismatic, or maybe the jokes are so funny that people just remember the jokes and um, they forget what the talk was about. Maybe it was about some theorem, or it was about some compiler optimization, or who knows what. And people have forgotten what the theorem or the optimization was. They just remember that so and so had a funny joke. I mean, to be quite honest, this is not something I worry about too much. I'll give you a bit of an anecdote that explains this. So when I was in grad school, I had this. Um, he's a very famous and distinguished graphics and robotics researcher who may be retired now, Carlos Secan, and he came in, and this was during the TA training class. And what he did was he just came into the room, and so all of us, there were like 15 students sitting around, in this TA training class, and this gentleman, he came in, and he just got up and stood up on the desk. I was like, "What's going on over here?" And he just stood there for 5 minutes without saying anything, and we were all perplexed. And then he got off the desk, and he's like, "So I just stood up on the desk for 5 minutes. You know why I did that?" And we were all like, "No, why did you do that?" And his exact words were, "Because now I know for the rest of your life you will not forget this lecture. And that is your number one job as an instructor, is to make sure people do not forget." And I mean, in a sense, he totally made his point. I mean, that his point was, you want to be memorable above all else. And here's how he did it. So I think it's a good question. I think, yeah, I don't want to be, I don't want to I want to give it full seriousness, but I think where most people who give technical talks are probably not at that level. I think they're at the level where if they can make the better they can make the presentation, the better it is for how well the message will be conveyed. Just because people will be kind of sticking to them, will be kind of tuning in and not have kind of dropped out. What do you think about starting from the complete example? Sorry, I'm transitioning to a second question. Oh gosh, the second question changed before my eyes. How long does it typically take you to put together a talk that you're proud of? So again, I should say this has changed a lot over time, because now many of the things I'm telling you have been internalized. Um, it used to take me several weeks. And I mean, it depends. Some talks take me at least 2 or 3 weeks. Some talks take even longer. But yeah, I mean, if I really, really want to make a kind of polished talk, we're looking at several weeks. And if you are a kind of a senior undergraduate or a PhD student, so I mean, recently one of my students is PhD students. He's a first year PhD student who, for all I know, is listening in right now. Is going to give a talk on PLDI on Wednesday, I think, in a couple of days. And I think he spent several weeks, I would say maybe 3 or 4 weeks, with several iterations, going over a talk that I was then proud of, right? I hope he's proud of it. I think it's a very good talk, but it took roughly 3 or 4 weeks. Wait a minute, the question has changed. Anna asks how to avoid talking deep theory of the paper. There is never enough time for that, while also not making the talk sound shallow in terms of technical contribution. Now, I should say it's a very good question, because there's also I don't know what to say, a cultural aspect to this. What I mean is, in some places, people really expect to see a lot of kind of quote unquote theoretical depth, like definitions, typing rules, stuff like that. I personally always shy away from that. To me, if I can convey what has been done by example, uh, that always is preferable to showing. If I can, to me, I don't. Okay, so this is, I should say, I should preface this with, this is my personal take, and different people will give you different answers. You should ask the other people on the panel, for example, this question. You may get very different answers, and their answers are equally valid. To me, the job is again, what is the goal, right? It all comes back to, what was my goal. My goal is usually, when I'm giving a talk, to convey some particular idea. And as long as I have conveyed the idea, I'm not worried about whether it sounds shallow or deep or not, right? To me, that particular question that you're asking is a very good question, but it comes down to, what is my goal? Was it to show you that I have some fancy theorem? If so, I'm going to build up a bunch of examples that show you this particular theorem, right? Um, but some people have this, and in at least American universities, there is this advice, and I remember getting this advice when I was graduating, that my actually I got this exact piece of advice from one of my mentors, who told me that, look, Ranjit, you're going to make a talk, you have to give a job talk and so on, and the problem with your talks is everything looks very easy, and people in a job talk, there's a point in that talk where they want to get confused, otherwise people will not be impressed. I'm just quoting what this person says. I mean, I'm just quoting what this person told me, right? So I think this is what you're referring to, Anna. So I think the way, if you really, really have to do that, and in some places where you go and give a talk, people will tell you, you really need to do that. It just is. It's like, let's not question why it is, and it just is, right? And you want to get a job, and so you want to kind of show off a little bit. It's also possible to do what you're saying, Anna, by just clearly signaling that here is the part of the paper where I am going to tell you about something that's quite technical. And it's okay if I lose some of you. Don't worry. This will be kind of clearly isolated and walled off. I will probably lose some of you. That's okay. I promise I will bring you back on board after the fact. Okay. So again, if you go back to that V-shaped curve thing, you're going to say, I promise you, some of you, I might lose you now, but that's okay. This is just for the people who really understand the technical nitty gritty about XYZ. It's for them. Bear with me. You do your thing. You get in, you get out, and then you pop back back up at a higher level where people can still follow. That's my personal recipe for addressing the question that you're raising, Anna. How do you actively listen? Anonymous asks, how do you actively listen to and learn from other great speakers and map it into your model of story, scene, and frame? Well, I think it's an interesting question, because I would say the answer is almost in the question. So in my head, the rubric that I have is the story, scene, and frame. And so when I watch, say, a stand-up routine, or if I watch James Mickens give a talk, what I try and do is I kind of deconstruct from that talk, because the story, scene, and frame is not made explicit, right? That this is a frame, this is that, right? So what I try to do is I try to. It's almost like I'm doing a field study where I look at the talk and I'm like, what was their what do I think their goal was? What do I think they are breaking? How are they breaking up their narrative arc into the individual landmarks, and what's going on with individual scenes and frames? So the reason I say the answer is in the question is because I've sort of internalized what my definition of what story, scene, and frame are, and I hope the slides have conveyed some sense of that to you. And then when I watch these other people give their talks, I try and reverse engineer what that is, right? And it gives me more and more exemplars of different ways in which you can construct the story, the different scene, and the different frames. So it's almost like Eran's talk, I guess. We're all neural networks. So in a sense, I have this thing of story, scene, and frame, and I'm just kind of trying to train my own classifier to what is this? What is the story here? What is the scene here? What is the frame here? And I'm building up. I have my own narrow thing, and then as I see more and more examples, I'm building up a repertoire of different ways in which you can structure stories, you can structure scenes, and structure frames or animations, and so on. Any tip? Theo asks, any tip regarding timing? What about answering questions in person, online? So Theo, that's a great question. So in many situations, this will be out of your hands. So for example, if this was, if we were all in London right now, then usually we would have held, if you were giving, a talk, usually they ask that you hold the questions to the end so as to not interrupt other people, because it's kind of an interruption, if it's in a live talk. If it's live streamed, it's different, right? Because you can have this separate bandwidth and so on. I personally, it's somewhat up to the speaker, right? I personally like interactive talks. When I lecture, it's just a constant stream of digressions based on what questions people are asking. But there is a balance there, right? You want to kind of make sure that you don't lose everybody just because you're digressing on random things. So in a lecture, that's okay, because like with paper, you can kind of go forwards and backwards. With a thing where there's a kind of tight linear arc that's already been imposed by the format, I think what works best is what Nadia, who's the chair of this session, suggested, which is to have specific points which are kind of transition points, which were for the particular talk that we just did. This bit where I was going from motivation to story to scene, and kind of break there and take some questions. I thought that worked pretty well. Anonymous, do you think it is important to research the audience, for example, talking about the same work? Oh, absolutely, that's crucial. So this goes back into the topic of goal. So sorry, I didn't read out the question. For example, if you're talking about the same work at an academic conference or to a group of industry folks, you might present the talk quite differently. In fact, your goal would be very different. If I'm giving a talk to, even at the same academics, right? If I'm giving a talk about some material to a set of experts on a particular topic, then I can assume a lot of shared background. I don't have to explain to them, every little thing, because they know all that, right? I can cut to the more bits that are quote unquote novel for them. While if I'm talking to a more general audience, then I have to provide more background. If I'm talking to, say, a more industry focused audience, then I have to maybe give you some more motivation. I can't just assume. So I work on, say, formal verification, right? I can't assume everybody believes that formal verification is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I have to give you some background about that. Yeah. So the audience is crucial, and to me, this is factored in your identifying the goal. What is it that you want to convey? Do you want to convey some clever typing rule? Do you want to tell people about your system? Do you want to tell people about how to use a particular tool and so on? And also the set of landmarks that you're going to choose in order to arrive at that goal. Anonymous asks, by the way, Nadia, I assume you will stop me at some point if I'm over time, or maybe.
Since we started late, I thought we can go until
Ah,
1:15. So we
okay.
have like 2 minutes, but you can stop at any point before that.
Okay, no, sure. I mean, I just want to make sure someone's going to ping me. It's not like this is a super hard question that I'm trying to avoid. Okay, so let's see. What do you think about starting from the complete example and deconstructing it in the flow of the talk, not just in the talk design phase? I'm not sure I follow this question. Do you mean like show the audience how you broke down the question? I guess this is a bit tricky. This would be easier with like a live Q&A. So I'm not really sure. I'll tell you what, I let Anonymous yeah, I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean like interactively deconstructing it in the, I guess that's what you mean, right? um I mean, I'll just give you my best interpretation of your question. So I think the way I think about making a talk is you first just do everything on pencil and paper. You kind of deconstruct the arc, etc., etc. And then in the talk itself, often you in fact do what you're suggesting, right? You take the example and you break it down and you sort of build it up. Sometimes it works well even to show people the whole thing and sort of break things up one by one. Oh, I see, just show it forwards. Yeah, that can work too. The trouble with it is you do want to make sure that people are not too intimidated when they see the whole example up front all at once. If they see that, they're like, oh my God, what just happened? This is so complicated, right? So you can tell people, look, don't worry, I'm showing you this big chunk over here, but you don't have to pay attention to it. I will gradually reveal the small parts of it as we need to go. And that works sometimes quite well. I've done that often. Not a
Okay, I think
question, but that's
we're
not a
out of
question.
time
Okay, sounds good.
at this point. So let's thank everyone. Let's thank Ranjit with a round of applause. So I'll applaud on audio, but you can applaud, of course, on Slack.